damaged, and then it leaked one into my kitchen, and the window sill leaked in my daughter's room.
Except they weren't. Enter activist David Lowry, who called Dalton directly. Suddenly, the house deemed livable on September 3rd became unfit for occupancy on October 15th. Lowry's theory?
As the investigation into Tiffany Henyard's alleged corruption intensified, more individuals came forward to expose her actions, a development she should have anticipated, given the controversy surrounding her administration from the very beginning. Just 6 months after assuming the role of supervisor of Thornton Township, the FBI began delving deeper into her operations, recognizing the need for a thorough understanding of her business dealings. Federal authorities formally requested all records related to her political fund, charity foundation, and township operations, signaling that her financial activities were under intense scrutiny. Even before the federal probe escalated, Tiffany had already faced mounting criticism from within her own ranks, particularly from members of her so-called Dream Team, a group she had personally selected to help run the township. She likely assumed this team would remain loyal and cooperative, but the reality proved far from harmonious. Trustees Tiana Beller and Jason House, along with village clerk Allison Key, initially expected to be her closest allies, quickly became some of her most vocal critics, refusing to overlook her unethical and questionable decisions. What was supposed to be a unified administration soon turned into a nightmare for Tiffany, as the very people she had handpicked to support her began challenging her leadership and exposing her questionable actions. Tensions escalated as the trustees, originally chosen for their perceived loyalty, started working with the village board to take legal action against Tiffany, accusing her of serious conflicts of interest. Their main concern was the growing evidence that she was using her position, not to serve the people of Dalton, but to further her personal and financial interests. This legal battle, which erupted just 6 months into her tenure, exposed the deep fractures within her administration and solidified the growing opposition against her. Instead of taking responsibility or addressing the concerns raised by the trustees, Tiffany retaliated in a desperate attempt to regain control. She accused them of deliberately inciting controversy and working against her vision to make Dalton great. In doing so, she painted herself as the victim of a political witch hunt rather than an official under investigation for serious misconduct. This response only deepened the rift between her and her former allies, making it clear that she was unwilling to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Meanwhile, the federal investigation into her business dealings only intensified, further eroding any remaining credibility she had. With the FBI scrutinizing every aspect of her political fund and charity foundation, it became increasingly difficult for Tiffany to maintain the facade of legitimacy she had carefully constructed. The scrutiny extended to the township's finances, raising even more questions about how public funds were being managed under her leadership. What had begun as whispers of corruption quickly turned into an undeniable storm of allegations, with more individuals stepping forward to reveal the truth about her administration. The turning point came when those who had once been Tiffany's staunchest supporters began publicly distancing themselves from her, recognizing the potential legal consequences of being associated with her. Tiffany, who had once projected an image of being untouchable, now watched her empire unravel before her eyes. Every attempt to silence her critics backfired, reinforcing the perception that she was more concerned with self-preservation than with the well-being of the township she was elected to serve. The lawsuit filed by the trustees further cemented the idea that Tiffany's administration was riddled with conflicts of interest. As legal battles mounted, it became increasingly clear that she was running out of options. What had started as a seemingly unstoppable rise to power was now turning into a slow but inevitable downfall, driven by her own actions and the refusal of those around her to continue enabling her. The deeper the investigation went, the more evident it became that Tiffany's leadership had been built on a foundation of corruption, manipulation, and self-serving decisions. Her refusal to take responsibility, combined with her aggressive attempts to retaliate against anyone who opposed her, only accelerated her downfall. The very people she had relied on to protect her were now among those working to hold her accountable. With federal authorities determined to uncover the full extent of her misdeeds and former allies aligning against her, Tiffany Henyard's political career appeared to be entering its final, chaotic chapter. As the investigation gained momentum, Tiffany's tactics became even more authoritarian. She barred trustees from their offices in an attempt to intimidate them, but rather than backing down, the trustees remained steadfast in their determination to remove her. They even went so far as to hold meetings without her involvement. While some questioned whether they were overstepping, the reality was that Tiffany's leadership had been failing Dalton in almost every way. Under her rule, the town grappled with crumbling roads, neglected and run-down houses, and a police force in desperate need of resources. Yet instead of addressing these pressing problems, Tiffany continued to squander public funds on frivolous expenses. Before she became mayor, Dalton had been a town that prioritized community unity and focused on the well-being of its residents. However, under her leadership, everything seemed to revolve around her personal image. Any event that did not directly promote her or elevate her status was either cancelled or deliberately undermined. One of the most egregious examples of her self-serving governance was her extravagant spending. Tiffany used taxpayer money for unnecessary billboards featuring her face, first-class flights, luxury accommodations at upscale hotels like the Four Seasons, high-profile DJs, professional photographers, and even a full security team for her personal protection. Her behavior became even more apparent when she actively obstructed a long-standing community event simply because it did not center around her. The event, an important annual tradition for Dalton residents, was scheduled to proceed as planned, but Tiffany refused to grant permission for the use of the public park. Her reasoning? She had scheduled her own competing event just a few miles away and did not want anything to take attention away from it. In an extreme move to ensure the community gathering could not take place, she ordered massive cement blocks to be placed at the entrance of the park, physically preventing residents from attending. This blatant obstruction demonstrated the extent to which Tiffany prioritized her personal reputation over the welfare and traditions of Dalton. Her leadership consistently reinforced the perception that she was more interested in maintaining power and status than in serving the community that had entrusted her with public office. As her grip on power loosened, the cracks in her carefully constructed image became impossible to ignore. Tiffany Henyard's political career had once been filled with promises of change and progress for Dalton, but over time it became increasingly clear that her ambitions had little to do with improving the lives of the people she was meant to serve. Instead, she became obsessed with control, silencing opposition and glorifying herself. The trustees, recognizing that Tiffany's leadership had become a liability to the town, were left with no choice but to take matters into their own hands. They worked behind the scenes to limit her influence and ultimately to remove her from power. Meanwhile, Tiffany continued to prioritize self-promotion, reckless financial decisions, and retaliatory measures against those who challenged her, all while Dalton's infrastructure and vital services suffered. The investigation gained momentum, and the voices of her critics grew louder. It became increasingly evident that Tiffany Henyard was not a leader invested in her community, but a politician consumed by self-interest, using every available resource to fortify her image at the expense of the people she was elected to serve. As the legal system and investigative bodies continued uncovering more evidence against her, many believed her downfall was inevitable. Regardless of where one stood on the issue, Tiffany Henyard's case served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked political power and the importance of holding elected officials accountable. The people of Dalton deserved transparency, honesty, and leadership that prioritized the needs of the community over personal ambition. As the investigation continued, the question remained, would Tiffany face the consequences of her actions, or would she continue to manipulate the system and evade responsibility? Only time would